so embarrassing. My natural roots are growing it. Hi, hey, hello. My name is Sunny, and welcome to a new series I would like to call Conquering Corsets. Now, what makes this series different from my regular content? Not much. This series is just to focus a bit more on the technical side of sewing, and corsets are kind of as technical as you can get. I'm sure I've said this before, but I'm pretty much entirely self-taught, and therefore might not do things like the correct way when it comes to sewing. Okay, the self-taught part was a lie. I did do one semester of textiles in high school, but all I got out of that was violation. Hello, Miss Substitute Teacher, because our regular teacher had jury duty the whole semester. Do you look at this pencil skirt I completely taught myself how to make and finished and tried on in the bathroom. Do you like it? Is it good? Ah, yes. This is not an Australian accent. I don't know what's happening. Oh, yes, it's very good. Let me check out that waistband. Oh, yeah, sure. Let me just. So, to improve my sewing skills, I thought we could learn together to make technical, supportive, and cute cosplays that have different kinds of corsetry involved, starting with X-Men 97's Goblin Queen.
I am beyond Jean Grey, beyond the X-Men. I am Scorn and Fury, forged in righteous brimstone. I am the Goblin Queen!
I have made something like a corset before, which is the bunny suit I made a while ago. It was one of the first things I ever made, and it was a completely made-up pattern that I did myself. It does its job. It looks like the piece and it stays on, but it doesn't actually cinch on my waist like a corset is supposed to. So I'm going to start at the beginning of corsets with Madeline, because her corset is apparently the easiest kind of corset to make because it's just under the chest there. There's a technical name for it. Before we start the corset, we have to make what goes under it with a little bit of what I like to call lazy girl sewing. And I don't know if you can hear the little kitty on my microphone right now because she's on my lap purring. And she's also in this video because we had like one day of sun for the first time in 2 months and she was loving it. To make the bodysuit, I simply measured the length I would want it to be, and then I measured the widest part of my body and I cut that out in a big giant square, which was folded on one side, and then I just pinned together the other side so it was one big tube that I then put on my body and pinned out my shape, not the shape, my shape, to then sew that on both sides. I then would try it on a couple of times, adjusting it where I wanted on both sides, along with some musical accompaniments. Let's take it in first. Okay, it was a struggle to get on, so I hope we're closer than it might feel like. With the sides all done, it was now on to the most awkward part of making the bodysuit, which was the crotch. So I pinned the front and the back fabrics together and just pinned between my thighs and my crotch. And I just pinned that, and I came out with this like really weird looking romper. Look at that. It's like a baby romper. And once that was all pinned, I just sewed it directly where I pinned. I'll draw a little so you can get an idea of the shape. With the structure of the bodysuit all done, it was time to shape it. So with some chalk, I drew out the shape of the top and the bottom and the legs. The bottom is the legs. And I only did this on one side of each so that once I had gotten the shape, I could just flip it over and copy that on the other side so they would be even. Hemmed that up nice and quick, and you could see some of my craft supplies on the floor. Ignore that. I then realized because the fabric was so thin, it was going to keep folding over, so I decided to sew some clear bra straps onto it. Next up were the arms, and I used the same, I don't think I mentioned the kind of fabric it is, but it is just a stretchy lycra fabric in black. But for the arms, I measured from my shoulder all the way down, and I did the same tube method I did with the bodysuit, where I measured the thickest part and just cut a square, and then I fitted that to my arm, and then I pinned along to kind of shape it out. Okay, and this looks super messy, so I'll do a drawing to explain what I did, but this is basically the seams are on the top and the bottom of the arm, and then this bit here is the space for the palm and then where the fingers joined. So I sewed both sides along there, and I sewed here and here for the finger connection. And if that made any sense, it should turn out like this, where there is a gap in the palm for the rest of my fingers, and then I just cut off the excess fabric. And the last thing to make with this lycra fabric was the boots. I did the Kinpatsu cosplay method of wrapping my legs in cling film. What is it called? I don't know. But I did that with the heels on to kind of get the right structure, shape. And I just traced that and cut 4 pieces out, 2 for each side, and I did 2 like mirrored pieces for the inside of the leg. So that was 4 pieces in total. I haven't explained my plan for these boots, but so the fabric goes up to my thighs, and then at the bottom they'll be slipped over this pair of heels that I have. But because the photo shoot I'm going to is on some grass, and also the heels I am working with are very tall and therefore very uncomfortable to walk in, I thought it would be smart if I didn't sew the bottom and instead sewed on fasteners to the bottom, so I was able to just take out the heels and change into some comfier shoes in between photos. And this was really helpful on the day because I was sinking so far into the mud. I'll put a picture up. So I will mention, every time you see me sewing or cutting this lycra fabric, it is inside out because it's just much easier to work with such a like slippy fabric that way. And it's how I mostly work anyways. I just wanted to add that to make sure. After some back and forth adjusting, this is what they ended up looking like. The next thing to make was the collar and the cape, and you really can't see it very well in this video, but I cut a circle out of some black cotton fabric to figure out the sizing I wanted, and then I used some leather fabric and I cut out the actual collar. And this pleather fabric I've had for a while, and I wanted to use it up because I had a ton of it that I wanted to use up for the cape, and also it's just a bit sturdier and heavier, so it'll give the cape a bit more weight. I then cut this circle into 3. I cut 1 line for an opening where I would attach some Velcro so that I could actually get it on my shoulders, and then I decided to cut sideways so that it would bend a bit more on my shoulder. And then I cut out a long tube, which would be the neck part of the collar. I then used the collar I just cut out to find the measurements for the outside of the cape, which is the black bit, and then I drew that out and I made it flare out at the bottom for that dramatic swoosh that she has. Then cut some spikies at the bottom, loosely based on her drawing, and then it was time to do the inside of the cape, which I got this gorgeous fabric for, and this was really nerve-wracking to cut out because it was so pretty. That's why we cut out the outside one first, so that we had a base to use as reference, but it was still so nerve-wracking to cut in. Then I lined up both sides, good side to good side, and pay attention to that gold underside because it's going to come back later. But I just sewed that together, flipped it inside out, and had a little bit of a revelation.
Cape! I don't know why I screamed. Look at that color! Oh my god, it's so delicious.
I then quickly hemmed both pieces and hand stitched on some fasteners so that I could make the cape removable, and then I attached the Velcro to the back to make it nice and strappy. And this fabric was really hard to sew with, especially if I was sewing on the top. I had my stitch pretty high up, but it was still pretty sticky. With the cape done, it was time to make the pendant that went on the front, and I just used a glass bottle to sketch out a circle I like the size of, and then did a smaller one on the inside, and that would be like the dimensions of the gem, and then the goldy stuff that goes around it. So I cut that out with like the biggest scissors ever for some reason. I then painted in the jewel after testing some red paints that I had, and then I just built that up with a dome of hot glue till it was nice and smooth. Once that was dry, I painted on some nail polish because I found out I really like this color better than the paint I was using, and also it had like a shine to it already, which worked for a gem. But I did that, and then I painted on the black swirl that you see in the cartoon because I like the cartoony aspect. I didn't want it to be super realistic, and I also don't have the skill to make it super realistic. But I did that, and then I built up a ring around it, which would be the first part of like the metally bit. I then built up the little bubble details, stuck the top and that together, cleaned it up, and that's how it ended up. And then remember that gold side of the fabric I mentioned earlier? Well, I took the scraps from the cape and I just cut out a hole in the middle and fixed it and glued it all around the pendant, all stretched out and shaped down. And then this is how it ended up at the end. And you might have seen that makeup palette, and that is because I did another thing with gloves. I was struggling to think of something that would add a bit of sparkle or like a way to show Madeline's magic through a prop, and then I came across this video here. I'm gonna put it up, and I thought it was a genius idea, and it would be really cool to show Madeline's powers because she has a bit of like green sparkly powers in her purple, so I thought some green and purple rhinestones would look really cool. And I did buy gloves. I did buy gloves, but they just never showed up, so I ended up buying some really cheap tights and cut my hands out of cardboard and sewed some quick gloves there, and I ended up doubling up just because the tights were so thin. I was also lucky enough to find like the perfect shade of threads just in my collection, so I hooked that up to my machine and turned my machine up to a really tightness, and I sewed some gloves. I then used some eyeshadow to build up a base on the fingertips with green and purple, and I probably should have used my airbrush, but I couldn't find the colors for it, but the airbrush would have been more vibrant. But then I handed the gloves off to my sister because she really likes rhinestoning, and it was just very helpful for me, and so thank you, Milka! But she glued on some false nails and then just built up a really cool pattern, and I got a couple rhinestones in different sizes, so we were able to do a bit of a pattern, and I thought it looked really cool in the end. And with that done, we can finally do the corset. And by finally, I mean I kind of started with this, but it's my video and I can choose where things go, suspense and all that. I found the pattern I wanted to use after scrolling through some Pinterest patterns, which led me to a Reddit comment section, which led me to this website, which people code patterns onto, where you just enter your own measurements and it adjusts the pattern according to your measurements. And it was so handy, and it was all free, and it was a really good tool. So I'm going to put that up here. It's not AI. They've just, each person codes it a certain way, and that's really smart. But I printed out the pattern and stuck it all together, and then I cut it out on some just plain cotton fabric to make a bit of a draft because, as my mother always says, measure twice, cut once. So we're going to do a draft, even though it's like my exact measurements. It's just making sure that it's how I like it. So I did that. I cut it all out on cotton, and then I tried it on. And then I cut it out on some plain black cotton. That would be our inner fabric. And then I cut out the same on our outer fabric, which was this really pretty black watery fabric that I thought looked very magical. Let me explain the pattern for a sec before we start sewing. So you have these 6 pieces that we cut out, and then this makes half of a corset. And then you flip them on the other side to get the other half of the corset, and these are the end pieces. You cut them mirrored because they're flipped onto the other half, so they're even, if that makes sense. And then you cut this out twice with 2 different kinds of fabric. One for the inner fabric that goes on the inside, duh, and then one for the outer fabric, which is the fabric people are seeing. And we need 2 layers of this, 1 so it's a bit sturdier, and 2 so that the boning can slip in between. Right, with that all sorted, it was time to actually start sewing the corset. So I started by lining up the 2 1A pieces together, good side up, and sewing a straight line down the middle of them. I then measured my bones to make a boning channel on either side of this straight line. So I basically sewed a straight line about 3/4 of a centimeter away from the line I just did on either side, using the dash on my foot as reference. Then, to attach our first piece, 1B, I lined up the cotton piece with the cotton piece of 1A, good sides together, which is how you usually sew with the inside facing out, but I lined up the cotton piece with the cotton piece and the outer piece with the outer piece, sewing a centimeter away from the lined up edges for the seam allowance. Once those were both sewn, I pressed both seams down and lined up the top and bottom layers and pinned those. I then sewed an edge stitch about 1 to 2 millimeters away from the seam. This kept my 2 layers evenly together and added a bit of strength to the seam. Then I sewed a boning channel parallel to this edge stitch using the same dash on my foot. Next was the next number panel, 2. As the lines of the piece weren't perfectly straight anymore, I started using the paper pattern, pinning that to the panel, and then placing and pinning the panels on top of each other, feeling for where the paper stopped, and pinning that, and this was in order to keep the correct amount of seam allowance. I want to add, because this took me a second to figure out, but on the on the front facing side, it's good side to good side, and this pattern is facing up, where this pattern is mirrored because you're unfolding it. And then on the back side, the pattern on what you've already built, it's facing down and it's facing up here, so when you flip it, it's regular. I don't know how to explain it. I sewed this, pressed it, and then did another edge stitch and a boning channel. Okay, so that's 2 done, so I'm going to keep going from 2 to 6, doing the exact same thing, just attaching every panel. Okay, that is the first half done, and now I'm just going to mirror it on the other side with the mirror cut pieces be cut to, yes. Which also means the roll that I mentioned before is just flipped. Unfortunately, I had a bit of a fumble with the footage for the next couple steps, so I'll try and talk through them. But I finished sewing all of them together, and then to finish either ends with the 6 panel and the mirrored 6 panel, I simply folded inward the seam allowance and sewed a line down close to the edge to sew those 2 pieces together. From that line, I sewed another boning channel. Then I marked out where I wanted my grommets to be, and then sewed a boning channel on the other side of that, because this part specifically has to be sturdy because you're yanking on it all the time to lace up the corset, and that's why 2 boning channels there are necessary. The next thing to do was slide in all the boning, and then hem the top and the bottom really quick. And then lastly was setting the grommets. And I again don't have footage for this, but I will do a quick recreation of what happened. And with that, the corset's complete. And I went off to a photo shoot with the wonderful Vision vs. Sight and Mark Ultra Cosplay, which Mark was kind enough to take some behind the scene pics. And if you want to see the amazing pictures Vision vs. Sight took that day, they're up on our Instas, and I will link those below, including Mark's. I will say that I was stupid enough to put my gloves on before lacing up my corset, so you don't get the full capacity of the corset on display, but the photos are so cool. Nicholas is so talented, and it's so nice to work with him, and what he did with the pictures is amazing. Be sure to check those out. But I am back from that now, and there's one small adjustment I want to make to the cosplay to make it a bit more functional, because it was something small that was bothering me all shoot. And cosplays constantly evolve, but I'm making this evolution right now in this video before the final segment because I am a bit of a perfectionist. But what I did was quickly sew my boots to a pair of tights because I was adjusting them every 5 seconds, and this way they would stay up more. So really quick as promised, and without further ado, the final cosplay.